This is what responsive design looks like on a desktop, a tablet, and a mobile phone. It's one of the most important things when building a website in 2026. Websites can come in all shapes and sizes, just like the devices they're viewed on. So in this video, I'm going to show you all the different ways you can create responsiveness in your web designs in just a few minutes. Here's what we'll cover: media queries and breakpoints, mobile first design and fluid design, attributes like max width, min width, view height, view width, all of which are utilized in responsive design, CSS grids, which are really good now at creating adaptable designs depending on the width, Tailwind CSS, as well as no-code builders for creating a responsive design, and last but also my favorite is using generative AI to create responsive design in just a few minutes. Really worth checking out. Now let's begin. Let's take a look at media queries in responsive design. We'll begin by creating this example here. A very simple media query that changes the CSS properties of this page when we resize it below the mobile responsive viewport. And while this might seem simple, it is the basic building block of everything else we'll do in the future parts of this video. Let's begin with a blank VS Code instance with an index.html file. I also have Live Preview. It's a VS Code extension that allows you to have an internal browser in your VS Code instance, and you can just run it by passing in a live preview here at the very top. When you make changes in your code, you'll see them in the browser immediately appear. I'll start by creating a h1 tag called responsive design and a h2 tag here called @media queries. Next, I'll create a couple of boxes. First, I'll create a div with a class box container, and inside of that, I'll create 3 divs with class name box and the label box 1, 2, and 3. Now to move on to the styles. Here I've got a style tag, and inside I'm going to create classes for the box container and the box. These will have the properties of display flex, flex direction row, and a gap of 10 for its children. For its children, I'll have the class name box with a width and height of 100 pixels and a background of CCC, which is this light gray. Now for the important part. We're going to create our very first media query. We're going to call @screen, and we'll pass in an attribute for the condition, which will be max width 480 pixels. In here, I'm going to override some of the classes. First, let's update the box container. I'll change the flex direction from row to column. And for the box itself, I'm just going to make the background a little bit darker. Now, when the viewport is less than 480 pixels, it's going to apply these new classes. Let's test it out. Here you can see that they've been applied, and you can see the difference, which would be applied normally on a mobile device. Now, let's take a look at max width and min width in responsive design. These two values can be set in the media query. For example, right now, unless our window is less than a max width of 480 pixels, these classes aren't being applied. I'm going to invert that by using min width. Now this media query essentially says that if this window is larger than 480 pixels, apply these classes. Otherwise, don't utilize them. There's many ways that min width and max width can be used. For example, if we start off at 768 pixels, this is tablet sizing, and these styles will only apply when we're in a tablet device view. Responsive design is often applied as we go down the media queries. First, we've got the media query for the tablet, which creates flex direction column and the background color of dark gray. And now I'll create one more here for a mobile viewport, where we'll make the box black, and we'll also change its width to 100%. As the width of the window reduces, you'll see that both these media queries are being applied because they're both true when it comes to the max width of the window. So to recap, this media query here applies for anything tablet or lower, this one applies for anything mobile or lower, and the ones above are just the global CSS. Now that you know how these work, we can combine them. We can create AND statements where we mix different conditions like max width and min width together to create a property that's only applied when it's between these two values. For this example, we're only applying the mobile responsive elements while the ones for the tablet aren't applied. There are instances where min width and max width being the same value can cause an overlap on that specific pixel. So I always recommend a 1 pixel difference between the two so that you don't get any glitching happening on that exact pixel value. You may have heard of mobile first responsive design. Our current example is desktop first, with conditions when we go down the viewports. We're going to swap this around and invert it so that the global classes are made for the mobile viewport, and we use the conditions and media queries to apply different logic to the classes as we go up the viewport rather than down. While this might sound complicated, all we're really going to do is swap the classes around. I'll move the classes I had earlier in the mobile viewport and lower into the global class section, and I'll also swap around the flex flex direction so that it starts off as column, and then as we get into the tablet viewport, we'll go to row instead. The resulting appearance for mobile first is exactly the same. The only difference is the code and the structure of how it's applied. The benefits are that you're always thinking about the mobile viewport first and foremost, especially when you write the code. However, I'm old school and still prefer to do a desktop first approach. Now it's time to take a look at breakpoints in responsive design. We've already had a look at two of the most important ones, which is the mobile viewport as well as the tablet viewport. But to be specific, anything between 0 to 480 pixels is often referred to as the mobile viewport. Anything between 480 to 768 is closer to a tablet viewport. From here, we start to get into the realm of desktops, and desktops come in all shapes and sizes. You might have anywhere between a 17-inch small monitor to something like an ultra-wide, and so there's a few different viewports that are available here. I like to arrange them in 3 views: small desktop, desktop, and large screen. For small desktop, it's somewhere between 768 to 1024, then a regular desktop is somewhere between 1024 to 128, and a large screen is 128 to 1536. Anything above 1536 is considered an extra large screen. It's good knowledge to know these values, and a lot of the CSS frameworks such as Bootstrap or Tailwind CSS all utilize these sorts of values when they create their responsive design classes. So try to follow along when you create your own manual ones as well, so that you stick within the normal standards. You also don't need to use all of them. You often only end up using things like the tablet or mobile viewport, where elements just don't fit into the screen naturally in these smaller sizes. Let's now take a look at fluid design in terms of responsive design. So far, we've looked at fixed responsive design, which is manually set with these media queries. We're going to get rid of these and create something more fluid, which doesn't require media queries, but adapts to the size of the viewport automatically. I'll add flex wrap to the box container, and I'm going to increase the boxes here to 200 pixels. You'll see that the boxes automatically drop down a level whenever there is not enough space to fit them in, and this is an example of fluid design at its core. I can improve this by setting the width here to flex 1. This will utilize the whole room of the container, and you can see that the boxes are essentially using up all that space, no matter what their viewport is. I can further improve this by setting a min width. I'll set it to 150 pixels. Now, if we go below that value, the boxes automatically wrap. And this way we have a different view for both the tablet and the mobile viewport, so that we always see all the boxes look like they're utilizing a good amount of space. Now let's take a look at view width with responsive design. It allows us to use the width of the window itself as an attribute. Let me show you an example. First, let me get rid of all this parse CSS and make the boxes inline blocks. I'll also remove the margin on the main body tag so that we can see the proper width for this spacing. If you still see a gap, then you might want to just remove any text blocks between the divs themselves, because that can also add spacing. Let's now set a width for these boxes. View width is a percentage, so 10 would be 10% of the window. 20 and 33 would be those percentages of the width of the window itself. There's a number of ways that responsive design can utilize this. For example, if I make the width 33.34, it's over 100 by the time it measures all 3 boxes, and so the third one will break the line. If I do 100, then it's always exactly 100% of the view width of the window. This isn't related to 100%, which is a percentage value based on the parent container, but it's specifically based on the window itself. And this is the main difference between using a percentage or a view width. What's interesting is that we can use view width for not just the sizing of boxes, but things like fonts as well. Here in my H1 block, I could have a font of 18 pixels or 24 pixels, and that gives me a static fixed size. But if I do something like 10 view width, or maybe something a little bit smaller like 5 view width, now we have responsive text, which increases and decreases in size as I change the width of the window. And this is another way that you can create responsive design text without having to run media queries for every single viewport. It's really cool. So let's actually apply another one here for the H2 block and see exactly how this works once it's all put together. Pretty neat and very easy to adapt to any type of code. View height is another thing that you can use in responsive design, very similar to view width. Let's replace VW with VH here for our H1 and H2. When we resize the width of the window, we'll see that nothing really changes. This is because view height is based on the window height. So if we make the height smaller, so does our text become smaller. and the same if we go higher. This might not seem useful for text, and that's because it's not. View height is often used for things like setting certain sections to be specific heights based on the user device, and most commonly seen in hero sections. This way, you can have full control of what a user sees above the fold, irrespective of what device they have, because it's based on the view height of the device window itself. So what I'm going to do is create a div called hero and a style here for our hero to be viewed with a background color. I'll begin with a view height of 50 so that you can see that it's taking up exactly half of the window's height right now. But traditionally for a hero section, we would want 100. This way it utilizes the entire height of this section. We have some text above, which is kind of in the way, so we can't see this properly. So let me actually move the responsive H1 and H2 blocks into the hero section. While this is just a gray box, traditionally we would put a background image for this, and it uses exactly the height that we're providing. For example, if I was to resize this window now and make it a little bit smaller, the actual above the fold section will shorten down to the specific height we've given it. CSS grids in responsive design move away from the manual way that we set responsive design in different child containers by creating something on the parent that's a little bit more automatic. Let me update this previous example here and create a box container which has a display of grid. Beneath it, we can set some rules for this grid. I'm going to set the gap to be 10 pixels between each one of the children. And I'm going to set a grid template of columns here with a specific rule that repeats. This rule will auto-fill this grid section with a min and max of 250 pixels width and 1 fractional unit for the height. Now, when I resize the viewport, the boxes automatically collapse once they get smaller than 100 pixels. You can play around with this figure. I'm going to increase it to 150 pixels, and this feels a little bit better for something that would work on tablet, mobile, and desktop. Now let's take a look at CSS frameworks in terms of responsive design. I'm going to be looking at Tailwind CSS since it's one of the most popular ones when it comes to creating nice responsive design components using class names. In order to use Tailwind CSS, a lot of packages already come with it baked in, but we're just going to use the CDN package here with a bootstrap of HTML that's ready to go. Let me copy paste this into our file and then copy paste a lot of the tags right here into the body. We don't need this style.css tag anymore since we'll be doing everything through class names. Here to start off, let me redesign the classes to work the same as they did before. Tailwind CSS uses utility classes to set styling. Like here, I'll make the text large for the title, and you can see it increased. These classes also create responsive design. Here, I'll add an SM column, and this applies that utility class only when the device viewport is larger than a small mobile device. This is because Tailwind CSS is mobile first. Here you can see that I can add multiple stacked type of classes for the text size and change them depending on the mobile viewport. Right now I'm just using SM, but there are actually quite a few different device viewports based on similar breakpoints we looked at earlier. There's the SM viewport at 640 pixels, MD viewport at 768 or above, which is kind of like the tablet, the LG viewport, which usually is anything with desktop or above, as well as XL and 2XL for extra wide monitors. I'm going to add the class hidden to box 1, and it's going to make it disappear. Then I'll add SM column block, and this will make it go from hidden to display block once we go over the mobile viewport. Using things like SM column, MD column, LG column, you can create different styling that applies only on those specific viewports, and this ends up creating a design that looks different depending on what device you're viewing. Here, let's play around with a couple of these by hiding block 1 and 2. And for block 3, we can change the height to be a bit larger, which reverts back to normal once we're back above the mobile viewport as well. You can see this means that we get just a single image, for example, on a mobile device, whereas we might get a feature section of 3 blocks here if you're on a desktop size. A no-code builder is another way to create responsive designs. For this example, I'm going to be using Wix Studio, which allows me to create websites without actually having to write traditional code, but responsive design is just as important. Here I'm inside of my dashboard, and I'll start off by just simply creating a brand new site from a template. What I'm going to do is just start off with a blank canvas, since that's probably going to be the easiest way to showcase different ways to create responsive design here. Firstly, we can create a grid layout with maybe something like a 2-column design. These 2 columns could collapse when we get to a smaller viewport. Let me showcase how this works in terms of no code. First, I'll place in maybe a title on the left and a paragraph here on the right hand side and just center them in these columns themselves. At the very top, you'll notice that I can swap down to a tablet and mobile viewport. But right now, a lot of the design is really kind of like a fluid design that changes the text to be a little bit smaller as we go down the viewports. Instead, what I want to do is select this section grid here and collapse it into rows rather than columns. This creates these two columns which look like they have a little bit more room on smaller devices, but we still have the two column design when we're in the desktop view. Let's take a look at another example, but instead of containers, this time I'll do some responsive text. I'm going to grab this paragraph here and paste it into the middle of this section and expand it out with a bit more text. On the right here, I've got responsive behavior. Right now, I'm on scale proportionally. This is where the text seems to get smaller and bigger depending on the viewport. Instead, I'm going to change this to wrap. This way, the text actually stays the same size, but as we shrink the viewport window, we can see that the text breaks additional lines so that it expands. This is the natural behavior that we normally experienced on the web, but there's a few others. We can also do fixed. Fixed isn't as useful as you might think, simply because it overflows over the container, but it does mean that everything stays consistent based on where you place it. And finally, we have hug, which means that it never breaks the line. And while this might be useful in some cases, I very rarely use it. Personally, my favorite is for text to scale proportionately to the viewport itself, because this feels the most fluid, and at each viewport you can change the main text size to make sure that that fluid design stays proportional to the device width itself too. Finally, we have AI-generated responsive design. And this is one of the coolest because it's something I haven't seen before. Here in Wix Studio, I can actually add in all the elements that I would want on a page, such as a header, a paragraph, a button, and maybe even an image. And rather than designing the responsive design myself, we can use a generative AI to create the best looking responsive design that I can have. Here in the section at the very top, I've got this button called responsive design. I'm going to select generate, and it's going to go through every viewport and create the most optimized design based on the elements I've provided in this section. Once it's done, which only takes about a minute or two, it shows me its results, which is just over here. It's used a mix of fluid responsive design together with actual breakpoints that collapses the column and even adds in padding and margin perfectly for each viewport and updates the text sizing and image as well. Another way to create a responsive design is using CSS in no code. Here I've got this text block called responsive design, and I'm going to enable coding on Wix Studio. I'll select Start Coding and head over here to the global CSS page. What I'm going to do is start adding some custom CSS code for this page for the elements in it by adding custom classes to items I have selected. Like this responsive text, I've added the custom class of testing, and I'm going to make the color red. This was to just show you how it works, but let's actually start creating some responsive classes in here in the CSS so that this text updates depending on what we're doing. I want to make the display of none, making this text block disappear when we go into certain viewports. But for the time being, I just want it to disappear altogether. And this is done with display none. Right now, it's still visible in the editor, but if we were to view it or preview it, it's gone. So what I'm going to do is set a media query in here and set the screen size for anything off tablet or below for it to disappear. This way we might want to have some custom text that gets displayed on mobile instead of this specific text, but it's still visible on desktop and above. Another thing is that you no longer need and screen these days for this. So a shorthand is just to call @media with the max width in brackets. Let me hit preview here and see if this works. So here on desktop, it's visible, which is great. Then on both tablet and mobile, there is no hero text. That's great, but now we need something to replace this hero text. Maybe something like a different block of text. So what I'll do is copy this block of text. I'll move it just above so it's next to the other one. And here I'm going to just create it called mobile title. This should only be visible on mobile and tablet, and that way we have two blocks of tests. I'll update the class to go from something like testing to mobile-title. Then inside of the CSS, I'll create a new class here called mobile title as well. well. And I'll have this as a display block when it's in a mobile responsive viewport, but otherwise I'll make it display none in all other viewports. Here you can see all of that together. Let's select preview, and now you can see that the responsive design here is available on desktop, but on tablet we have the mobile title appearing. This is useful when you start creating complex websites with lots of content that you need more manual control over, and it's a way that I often find done in any type of no-code framework. JavaScript in no-code is another way we can create responsive design. Let me start by removing this CSS we previously had, and instead of that, we're going to utilize JavaScript. We can head over to the left-hand panel here and head to either the masterpage.js or the About Us.js page. The coding panel is at the bottom, just like our CSS panel, and the first thing I want to do is create an ID for both of these elements. I'll call the bottom one mobile text and the top one desktop text. We can now reference these in the JavaScript using the ID selector by calling $W and then in brackets just adding it kind of like we would do in jQuery. However, before we do that, we need to reference the window object to see the width of the window. And in order to do this, I'm going to import Wix window from the Wix window package. We can call this inside of our onReady. So here I'll pass in if Wix window dot form factor is equal to mobile. We're going to show the selector here with our mobile dash text, and then else we're going to hide it. I'll also want to do the inverse of that for the desktop text. So going back here, I'll just copy this string out, and instead of mobile text, I'll reference this as the desktop text. And in this case, instead of show, I'm going to do hide, and then the inverse on the else side. So with that, we should be able to create a system where these two texts swap in and out depending on the viewport. Let's test this out. Here in the preview, the page loads up. We can see just the responsive design text. And if we head over to mobile, then we can see the mobile text instead, and the responsive text changes up. Of course, this would happen more in real time, but it's an example of how you can use JavaScript to create responsive design. If we want to make this more friendly on the no-code platform, we can actually right-click on the elements and hide them in the respective viewport, because this is essentially doing the same thing, and that should give us a visual representation of how they should look like if this JavaScript was applied. Just be aware that if you do feel like you've lost elements or you've hidden them, you can head over to layers and you can just show them here on the left-hand side to bring them back to the viewport.